If you've seen my review of the Resident Evil 2 remake, you'll know that I've mostly agreed with the praise the game has been receiving. I'm actually a fan of the Resident Evil series since its inception and have played the original games, but it's been so long that I've practically forgotten almost everything about them, so the remakes feel like new experiences for me. However, I do remember that I enjoyed Resident Evil 3 more than I did 2 back in the day, so now my expectations are even higher for this remake than they were for the previous one. With that being said, let's first look at the game's ultra-wide support. The Resident Evil 3 remake supports 21:9 natively. If you have a larger ultra-wide monitor though, you will have a hard time since 32:9 is not supported. This means that you will need a fix for it to work. And this is also where things get very complicated. You see, the game's anti-tamper will actually be triggered if you apply any kind of fixes that enable you to play at this resolution. Your game will run in 32:9, but the game will also soft lock, making it impossible for your character to interact with anything. Meaning that it will be rendered useless. You will not be really able to play. You'll just be able to walk around a little bit. So in other words, the DRM is screwing over the paying customer yet again. You know who has no problems applying this fix? Pirates. So if you want to play the game in a legitimate manner and at the same time use 32:9, you have no choice but find a crack on the internet, apply it, and then apply the fix. Otherwise your game will break once you apply the fix without having cracked it first. It's a pain in the ass and could have been avoided by simply adding 32:9 natively inside the game or offering it without DRM. One can dream, I guess. But since we're at it, I've also modded the game a bit and made some changes to Jill and Carlos. I mean, just look at him. He looks so much better as Devil May Cry's Dante than the original model. At least that's what I think. And these changes are absolutely minimal. Trust me, some of those mods can get really nuts. I mean, I guess it can be pretty funny to have all of the main characters walk around naked with giant erections while killing zombies, but it also poses some serious questions about their motivations. Are they really here to save civilians? But jokes aside, just go on and check out all the mods. There's some really crazy ones. And I've had a ton of fun just looking at them. Obviously, I just stuck to these ones because I want my game to still look nice and not be too silly. But I know that a lot of people go for the silly mods and create outrageous looking characters that they can play as, or against for that matter. I mean, Resident Evil 2 was also moddable as much as you want. Can one say that? Moddable? That doesn't really sound like a word. Well, in any case, it was very easy to mod, but I think that Resident Evil 3 has even crazier ones, in part also because they can use models from other games more effectively. Let's go back to the actual review. Since Resident Evil 3 uses the same kind of engine as Resident Evil 2 did, we have the same problems reoccurring here as well. For one, Jill runs at a pretty relaxed pace, no matter the situation. Is a giant monster chasing you? In that case, be sure to jog lightly. You don't want to overexert yourself. At least that's what it looks like Jill is doing. She just runs really slowly, and that was the same thing happening in the Resident Evil 2 remake. I'm not saying make the characters fast, but the animation just seems somehow relaxed. I don't know. I mean, in the original game they were doing the same thing, but it somehow feels inappropriate here. I mean, if a monster like that is chasing me, you'd be amazed at how fast I would be running away from it. And since Resident Evil 3 was a step away from the classic survival horror and getting more and more action oriented, Jill is a typical action hero from the 90s. She shows almost no fear and has more balls than a football team. Everyone's running from Nemesis, she decides to not get to safety but instead engage it. Not only that, but she even taunts the monster. The craziest part is when she got hit by a rocket and just brushed it off like it was nothing. It's just one of those things where you can think to yourself, yep, this is a 90s action hero I'm looking at. Where the first game had some elements of badassery added to it, this one is just oozing with it. I started the game slightly tense as I normally do when playing a horror game, since I didn't know anything about it yet and was going to play carefully, but soon realized that my approach was simply wrong. The game is 80% action and 20% survival horror. So much so, as a matter of fact, that I'd say they made the remake feel almost entirely like Resident Evil 4 felt, where the game was encouraging you to engage your enemies straight on instead of trying to avoid them and conserve as much ammo as possible. That's a bit of how this game feels now. And that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. For me personally, that was actually quite enjoyable. If you've played Resident Evil 2, you will remember how Mr. X was not only scary, but he was also a constant menace. I remember traversing the Raccoon City Police Department and just hearing the steps of Mr. X somewhere close to me. It caused me to simultaneously be annoyed, but also have this feeling of impending doom, which is not the case here with Nemesis. While Nemesis is annoying, he's no longer menacing. The game even encourages you to fight him in every encounter if you wish to do it, and rewards it. The new evasion mechanic really adds to the whole badassery feeling, since you can always evade attacks no matter what. You will also find a lot more ammunition this time around. All in all, you are supposed to fight here and not as much run. Another thing I enjoyed was the fact that the game has less backtracking and the levels are simpler. Believe it or not, I actually beat the game the first time around without having to check the map once. These levels are now more open and you will spend a lot more time outside as well. To me, that's a plus. You still get to explore a bit of the police station, and since the game is a prequel, you can even do some damage, which will then be there when you play the Resident Evil 2 remake. Something that ended up confusing me initially was the fact that when a zombie grabs you, you get a QTE, but it doesn't appear to do anything. In the previous game, you would use up your knife to free yourself without taking damage, but here the knife never breaks and you cannot use it in the same way. So I checked online because I was curious if I'm doing something wrong, and it turns out the QTE is actually determining how long the zombie will hold on to you and how much damage it will do. I can't be sure, but this might have actually been the same way in the original game, but I just don't remember anymore. I have vague memories, that's all. Correct me if I'm mistaken in the comments. Some people seem to dislike the fact that you get to play as Carlos as well. His sections are even more combat heavy. I found him to be just as challenging and fun as Jill's on my first playthrough, but on the second one I understood what the fuss is all about. You see, he doesn't share inventory with Jill, so playing as him is an inconsequential distraction. It feels like you're being redirected from your main event. You want to continue to play with your arsenal and gather more. At least that's how I felt. Perhaps they should have made it like it was in Resident Evil 2, where you do one playthrough as Jill and one as Carlos. The problem is, as long as you have to play with Carlos, any ammo you find, any upgrades you find, all of that will be lost after a short section. You don't keep that progress and it really isn't that useful to you. Yeah, it's useful for the particular part, but then it's all gone, so it feels like you're doing this for no reason. Whereas while you're Jill, you know, okay, everything I find, I gotta stack properly, I gotta make sure I have enough space in my inventory because this is the stuff I'll be carrying around throughout the whole game. When it comes to the story of the game, I have to say that it's quite weak. At least in Resident Evil 2 you had some additional characters and a deeper story. Here, it's all very boring and more akin to, well, you guessed it, a 90s action movie. I want to actually tell you more because there is so little here that I'm afraid that any small amount of information would give away a large chunk of the minimalist story that is presented here. Just know that while the game is overall easier, it can still be quite challenging, even on the lower difficulties because of some of the monsters which you will encounter. In the hospital, for example, you will be fighting a pretty fast mutant, which can kill you with a single hit if you're not careful. And I mean, that's pretty badass. So you just meet it slashes once you're dead. It surprised me when it happened, and it will probably happen to you too, because there's no way to prepare yourself for this. It's just, I think that's how the game shocks you the first time. But, you know, you probably would have saved fairly close by, so it's not that big of a deal. At least it wasn't for me. The game also grants you points after each playthrough for the various challenges that you have completed. These points can be used to buy such things as weapons with infinite ammo and other nice things that you can get from a special point shop inside the game. This adds yet another layer of replayability to the game and simultaneously makes you do specific things which you might not have otherwise. I found the challenges to be quite fun as well, and generally it makes for a more interesting playthrough if you're trying to, let's say, shoot off the hat of a guy, or you know what I mean, just stuff like that you wouldn't do. It just gives you another thing to do while you're playing. I've mentioned how you fight Nemesis several times, but now it's time for me to talk about the problems with that. You have encounters with him which are scripted and where you are encouraged to escape, and then you have actual boss fights which take part in arenas and escape is not an option at all. The latter are actually surprisingly easy. For all of his might, Nemesis is a pretty stupid enemy, and the more powerful he becomes, the less he seems to want to just rush Jill and mess her up. I know that it would obviously make no sense for him to transform into a giant beast and simply kill Jill with a single bite, at least not from a gameplay perspective, because that would not be fun, but they could have made it so that Jill is on a vehicle, or there is some kind of environmental hazard that explains why the boss can't just kill her instantly. Instead, they just make him into a huge doggo, which just runs in circles from time to time. And this happens several times, not just once. So you have this boss fight with him where he morphs into this giant canine looking creature, and instead of just rushing at you and biting you, or which would make sense, he decides to run on the walls in circles several times, waiting for you to basically shoot him so that he can fall off. Now on to another controversy, the game's length. It took me a bit over 6 hours to complete the campaign the first time around, and I had good fun playing it. And yes, it is short, but it's still good. Personally, I prefer a short but well-made game over a long game which is padded front, back and center so that you waste your time with this stuff. I just don't like it when the game tries to waste my time just so I can say, hey, I have this very long playthrough time or whatever. You have to also consider that replaying the game at least once is almost a must. It's just so much fun, especially if you unlock some of these special weapons with infinite ammo. In my case, for example, I wanted to fight and defeat Nemesis on higher difficulties every time the game presented me the option to escape. At some point when you replay the game, peace is no longer an option for you. You are geared to the teeth, you already know what to expect, and you will kill Nemesis every time you see him, regardless whether the game lets you escape or not. And once you know how things are, you have a general idea of item placements and so on, it just gets more fun and easy, even more so than the first time. It gets even more interesting on higher difficulties where all the items and enemies are placed differently, meaning that the game now has a whole new feel to it since you really don't know where to go to get what you needed. In other words, while the individual playthrough here is shorter, I actually still got over 20 hours from the game in total and had great fun the whole time. And this comes from someone who doesn't like Resident Evil Resistance, the multiplayer game which comes with RE3 Remastered. If you're someone who enjoys Resistance, however, then you can easily add another 50 hours on top of your game time, because that's a whole different mode. You can level characters up there and do a lot of things, but it just was not my cup of tea at all. Interestingly enough, while the game looks really similar to the Resident Evil 2 remake, it feels different when playing it. For someone like me who prefers a bit more action and a little less old school survival horror, this game is more enjoyable than its predecessor. With its new graphics, the great voice acting, and the fun gameplay, Resident Evil 3 is definitely a game most people will enjoy playing. It's also the game I would recommend first to anyone who wants to try the remakes, since it's more accessible and forgiving. Once you get used to this one, moving on to Resident Evil 2 will be a smooth ride and will also make even more sense from a chronological point of view, since Resident Evil is ironically a prequel and a sequel to Resident Evil 2. That's right, part of the adventure happens before Leon and Claire come into Raccoon City, and part of it happens after they leave it. This has been my review of Resident Evil 3, the remake. It's a good game with minor issues. For the most part, it plays and looks like a 90s action movie, and it does that really well. Don't expect realism or complicated puzzles because you will not find them here. I want to thank you for watching my video. I hope it was informative and entertaining, and would be very happy if you watch some of my other ones as well. I hope to see you on the next one, and until then, have a great day.
Get it out! Gross.